o'clock here, so we'll kick things off. For those of you that have not attended, one of the first public meetings, my name is Ben Schulte. I'm one of the environmental engineers with the city of Fitchburg, and today we have Anne Marie Kirsch with AE2S.
Yes, hi, I'm Anne Marie Kirsch. I'm a water resources engineer at AE2S here in Madison, Wisconsin. And we were contracted by the city of Fitchburg to look at alternatives for stormwater management within the Seminole Glen area. So today I am here to talk about a few things. Why are we here? And some of this is going to be a review from the first PIM, so I just want to kind of bring people up to speed that may not be, haven't been here for the January meeting. But there was a stormwater plan done in 2000 for the Seminole Glen area. And obviously looking at the aerial photos going through time, we all know that Fitchburg has seen a lot of change, a lot of development. Going back to 1987, we had woods, we had farm fields, we had pasture. And then, around 2000 when this plan was first developed, yes, you're starting to see development. And you can see right in the center of the photo in the middle is the Seminole Glen, the upper wetland kettle. And then finally in 2022, you're seeing a lot more development, including more commercial and industrial uses on the west side, and then North Stoner Prairie to the south side of Seminole Glen. So as the woman was talking before the meeting, that yes, the big driver for this were the big flooding events that happened in August of 2018. Parts of Madison, Middleton, and Fitchburg saw upwards of 13 inches of rain in about 6 hours or so. And that's literally off the charts for rainfall based on our historic record. In some areas of Dane County, that translated to be nearly a 1,000 to 3,000 year event, depending upon where you were, how much rain you got, and how long it took for that rain to fall. And this significant flooding that occurred, it stayed around for a long time. It took a long time for water to infiltrate or evaporate, and in doing so, it did cause die-off of a number of the mature trees in this kettle. So, as discussed earlier, yes, there was tree die-off. I mean, oaks don't like to be wet for that long. And also, the huge amounts of runoff and the sheer stress and the velocity of the water caused a significant amount of erosion, especially between the wetland kettles in Seminole Park and then the forested kettles at the downstream end of this system. And so one of the things that also came out of this study as it was starting to get going is that residents also had concerns about water quality, which is an ongoing concern, not just in Fitchburg and Dane County, but throughout the state and in all of the waters in the U.S. So we're going to touch on that too as we go through this presentation. So going back to the history of this project, the request for proposals was originally issued in about October of 2021. Some of you may be aware that there's been a significant number of changes in staff in the city of Fitchburg, which is great. So it just took a while for this project to really get going. So in January of 2023, we had a project kickoff, and that involved the first public information meeting here in the City Chamber of Councils. And the meat of that presentation was talking about the goals, the objectives, and to really take feedback from the comment about concerns, questions, and to give more information about what we were planning to look at. So this is, again, talking about the project timeline where we started looking the funding was approved in 2022. January, we had the public involvement meeting. We had done some of the existing conditions analysis at that point. And then from February until about now, we've just finished looking at our 3 to 4 main alternatives and water quality. And right now, we are here at public involvement meeting number 2. And at the end of June and into July, we'll be finishing the report and doing a project wrap-up. So here's some contact information. We have a QR code, you can use that, you can scan it, and that will get you a link to the project page on the City of Fitchburg's website. Or Ben here is the Senior Environmental Engineer for the City of Fitchburg as well, and his email and phone number is up there. So at the public information meeting number 1, we talked about what were the causes of flooding. And this isn't much of a shock to anybody who's lived in Fitchburg for any length of time, but Fitchburg has a lot of kettles, generally left by the last glaciers that came. They melted, they left these kettles that are clay lined. They often don't have great surface drainage, so they fill up and they infiltrate very, very slowly through the clay lens under the kettles. Again, we have changes in these watersheds. We have more and more urbanization. The more pavement you have, the more rooftops you have, that means more runoff, and it happens more quickly because it has a faster path to get to where it's going. And the other thing that we've had lately is historically wet climate. Not this year, but in years past, yes, it's been historically wet. And we had talked about this. You could look at climate data going back to 1895, and you can just look for the last 20 or 30 years. It just keeps getting wetter and wetter and wetter. So that affects infiltration, groundwater saturation, groundwater tables, making it more difficult for stormwater to infiltrate. So the purpose of this study was to look at several things. Determine the specific cause of flooding, where exactly is this water coming from and how is it getting there? Then to look at alternatives to say, well, what can we do to reduce the risk of flooding? And then also consider impacts, if any, to water quality. And then finally recommend design alternatives. So we had also talked about the existing model results, and we'll touch on that just a little bit here. So looking at the existing model results, sorry, this is the outline for this meeting, sorry. We're going to talk a little bit more about the existing model results just as a review, talk about the alternatives that we considered and the results of our modeling, and then we're going to talk about the recommendations. What do we think is the best approach for reducing flooding risk? And then finally, what are the steps after this project is done? And Ben can also talk to that a little bit more because he's got more inside information on the capital improvement plan. So when we look at the aerial photo here, all of those yellow outlines are what we call our subbasins, subcatchments. So each one of those generates runoff from the rainfall that falls on it. And how much and how fast the water collects depends upon many different things. The size of the watershed, is it connected by storm sewer? What kind of land use is in the watershed? The more houses, the more pavement, again, more runoff more quickly. Storm sewer can also cause water to flow more quickly or collect more quickly. So the existing model also looked at storage. The wetlands in the park, as well as the forested kettle at the lower end of the watershed, really behave as large bathtubs. So we actually looked at how big are those bathtubs, how deep does the water get, and once that overtops, how much is overtopping and where does that go to? So the other thing that is unique to this project is North Stoner Prairie. When it was developed, as part of their stormwater system, they have a gate which was open during the 2018 event and allowed overflow from their system to get into that lower kettle. That gate has been closed since that event in 2018, but we did look at the impact on that gate, whether it should be open or closed. And as we went through this project and looked at alternatives, there was really no upside to opening that gate for any of the design alternatives that we looked at. And then finally, for the existing model, we looked at rainfall. And again, this is something that is changing over time. And as we gather more data, one of the challenges we have is we're predicting future rainfall by looking at the past. And in some areas, we only have rainfall records going back to, early European settlement that we have measurements for. And until recently, we were actually doing design in Wisconsin, for the most part, using data something called Technical Paper 40. And this was a catalog of rainfall that they stopped collecting in 1959. So we were developing current infrastructure based on 70-year-old rainfall data. So that's that's been updated recently in NOAA Atlas 14. So looking at rainfall going all the way up into about 2020. And actually it's being reanalyzed now for NOAA Atlas 15, looking at changes of climate and what the additional risk associated with climate change will be in the future. So what did we find? So looking at this, especially in the lower area, we found that for the 10-year rainfall elevation, the depth got to about 999.6 feet. And for the 100-year water surface elevation, it was getting to about 1,005.2, at which point it is overflowing and going into Schumann Drive. The challenge is that at 5856 Schumann Drive, that walkout elevation is approximately 999 feet. So even in a fairly modest event, a 10-year event, which is what we generally design our storm sewer system for, that home could be at risk. So again, overflow to Schumann Drive is definitely occurring at the 100-year events and possibly even a little bit more frequently. So now that we have a handle on the existing conditions, we're going to talk a little bit more about the alternatives we evaluated. So alternative one is just basically do nothing. What happens if we just leave the gate from North Stoner Prairie closed and just go with business as usual? And keep in mind that the storm sewer at Schumann Drive is at about elevation 1,000. So that water has to get really, really deep in that lower kettle before it can possibly get into Schumann Drive. So alternative two is to reconstruct Schumann Drive storm sewer at a lower elevation with increased capacity. And this would also have a passive outlet. So once water got high enough, again, looking at that 10-year water surface elevation, and that has a particular meaning, which we'll talk about when we get to water quality, that protects the home at Schumann Drive, but still allows water to get out of the system. And then alternative three was to construct a berm between the kettle wetlands up in the park and the forested kettle lobes in the lower end, and also to lower the Schumann Drive storm sewer. And then finally, this one we're not really going to talk about much because it didn't have a meaningful impact, was to construct a berm in the park only. So that would be just increasing the storage a little bit in the wetlands within the park to see what kind of impact it would have downstream. And while we looked at it in detail, it's pretty intuitive that the kettles in the park are not nearly as big as the forested lobes, and you really can't stack that much water in there to offset what was happening in the forested kettles. And then we did originally look at additional infiltration, both in the park and in other areas, like try to get the water into the groundwater system faster, but it's really not feasible because of groundwater and the soil properties. Again, typical with a lot of glaciated kettle wetlands, there's a lot of clay underneath them, so the infiltration's just not great. And then finally, when we talk about water quality impacts, they are very much modeled separately from flood risk reduction alternatives. When we're looking at flood risk reduction, we're looking at the 10% annual chance event, which is sometimes referred to as the 10-year flood. But we want to think about that as the storm that has a 1 in 10 chance of happening in a given year. Or even the 100-year flood, when people talk about floodplains, that means that storm has a 1% chance in happening in any given year. Now, when we talk about water quality, we're talking about the smaller, more frequent events, because it's those short, small rainfall events that detach the soil and move it away. And by the time we get to these bigger storms that are the 10-year or the 100-year storm, most of what's moved is already moved. And the water gets progressively cleaner as the storm gets bigger. So this is a schematic showing what happens if the gate is closed. So we have the wetlands in the park, we have the overflow channel that goes along the bike path, we have the lower forested lobes, and then we have the gate closed at North Stoner Prairie. And then we also have the storm sewer down Schumann Drive, but the water just can't get there until it gets deep enough in the kettles. So, so that's the North Stoner Prairie. So alternative 2, sorry, that's what happened. So this is essentially the same as, well, this is not the same. So sorry, we're still keeping North Stoner Prairie gate closed, but where the red outline is, that's the Schumann Drive storm sewer, and that would be lowered, and it would also have an outlet, almost like you would see in a constructed detention basin, to let water passively out of it, and once it gets high enough, it would flow into the Schumann Drive storm sewer system. And this would be a schematic of that passive outlet structure. So you'd have a pipe that would be submerged during a storm event. The water would get high enough, it would go over the weir plate in that manhole structure, and the top of that is set at that 10-year water surface elevation. And then if water gets even higher than that, now you have a grate on top of this manhole that will let water in the fastest and get it down more quickly to that 10-year water surface elevation. So again, this top of the Schumann Drive storm sewer system would be decreased about 992.6 feet. So that would be about 7.5 feet lower than it is currently. So that's the plan for that. And then alternatives 3 and 4, again, talk about, we discounted option 4, which was just the berm in the park. Now, alternative 3 would be doing all three things: leaving the gate closed at North Stoner Prairie, lowering the storm sewer system on Schumann Drive, just as we talked about, and then finally adding a small berm between the wetland in the park and the channel. And that would have two primary focuses. One, it would back water up a little bit and slow it down coming out of the park into the lower kettle. So it would provide some like storage, but it would also reduce velocities into that channel and help reduce erosion, which affects water quality. So the results. So the answer is, what does this really mean? And as you might anticipate, alternative 1, just closing the gate, we see that the 100-year flow rate is out of the kettles upstream. This would be out of the park before we get to this is at the wetlands. So we know that we're not doing anything there until we add the berm, which is alternative 3. So that is increasing the 10-year flood elevation by about 0.2, and there should have. This is not quite right. Okay. We were seeing about a foot of increase, and I need to go back and check this. We were seeing about a foot of increase for the 2-year event because we were putting about a foot. There's an error in the table, and I apologize. But we're seeing a slight reduction in flows. We're not seeing any discharge for the 2-year event. We're seeing a significant decrease in the 10-year event and a small decrease in the 100-year event. And I'm pretty sure that 2-year flood elevation should have been 107.3 or 7.2, but I will check, and we will correct this on the website when Ben posts it. So this is at the forested kettles, and this is where the home is at more risk of flooding, right next to the lower kettle. So for alternative 1, that 100-year flood elevation is 1,000.9, which puts the home at risk, the walkout basement. That 10-year flood elevation is 994.5. With alternative 2, lowering the storm sewer, that's where we're seeing kind of the most bang for the buck, so to speak. We're seeing a significant reduction in that 100-year flood elevation. but the 10-year is staying the same because that's where we're setting it on purpose. And now is a good time to talk about that. The reason we're doing that is when something doesn't discharge water for up to the 10-year event, that's considered an internally drained area, according to Wisconsin DNR. And the city of Fitchburg, along with any other community of 10,000 people or more, has to have their discharge permit for their storm sewer system in the city. And they need to meet water quality standards also for their permit, and also as part of what's called the Rock River TMDL, which is looking at how much stuff, usually phosphorus and sediment, can get into the Rock River, and also many of its tributaries, which are considered impaired, which would include like Lake Wabisa and the Ahara River, Badfish Creek. All of these different water bodies are impaired. But if no water leaves for that 10-year event, what happens in terms of water quality within this system can neither count for nor against the community. It's kind of, and the reason for this is because water quality events are the more frequent events. And it's saying, okay, you're trapping all of this water in this kettle for up to the 10-year event. Anything that goes out after that is considered relatively clean and isn't going to move the dial on the day-to-day water quality in these large streams. And then alternative 3, we're seeing a slight improvement, both in the 100-year flood elevation, and so it's providing some benefit, but again, it would be in combination still with lowering that storm sewer system on Schumann Drive. That's the most important part. And now I'm going to transition a little bit to the water quality modeling. So again, as I talked about earlier, the water quality modeling is based on smaller, more frequent storm events. And the approach we used was using WinSLAM. And SLAM stands for Source Loading and Management Model, developed by an engineer here in Wisconsin, and it's used nationwide actually to predict how much stuff, and that stuff is, again, usually sediment and phosphorus, is generated by different land uses. So again, you would predict that a rooftop or a driveway or a freeway are going to produce different loads than, say, a cemetery or a golf course. And then it predicts where this water quality, where the pollutants are going within the system. And it's based on what's considered typical rainfall for the city of Madison, which in our case is based on a series of 24-hour rainfall totals for 1981, which sounds weird, but it's used because there are no super dry months and there are no super huge rainstorms to kind of skew the results. And the upshot of this is that the runoff quality into the wetlands and kettles are not impacted by our proposed alternatives, because what's coming in is what's coming in. It's the houses that are already there. It's the rooftops that are already there. It's the parkland surrounding the kettles. And when we think about the photos that go back to 1987, when it was still all ag land, there were still water quality impacts on the kettles because they were probably receiving agricultural runoff instead of urban runoff. And again, because the SLAM modeling is looking at these lower flows, it's trapping everything. Nothing is getting out for that 1981 series rainfall event. So under existing conditions, we're seeing what would be called 100% total suspended solids removal. And we will still continue to see that 100% total suspended solids removal. Now, the bad news, and this talks again about the Seminole Glen area neither counts for or against the city in their what's called a WIPDES permit because it's considered internally drained by DNR standards. So this is just a schematic of the watershed, and again, it's really a tinker toy model that's put together, and each one of those blobs is representing a drainage area, and within those blobs, we're defining how much land there is and what those different land uses are. Is it residential? Is it park? Is it a freeway? And it's not a freeway in this condition. And then the modeling's looking at the rainfall on the area, where it's going to. And in this case, the wetland areas in the park are modeled as wet ponds with no infiltration. And the kettles in the forested area are modeled as ponds, because they're behaving as ponds, with infiltration based on typical soils in the area and in the and infiltration rates that have been seen previously. Now, the good news is that there's no change in water quality leaving the ponds. The bad news is that whatever's still being detached in the watershed is getting to that lower kettle. And I think that's what a lot of the neighborhood has seen, is that water doesn't infiltrate as quickly as it did before. And that could be very well because of a buildup of sediment and silt in the kettle itself. So moving forward, again, this is the tabular output that's showing 100% TSS removal. And the circled column there is showing that there just is no outflow for any of these storm events in 1981, according to this model. And so that said, you've got the modeling results that say that there's no change, but what can be done within the watershed itself? And one of the things Ben has seen is said, well, we know that we have some gully erosion going on near the Seminole Hills pool. That's something that should be addressed, and let's talk with them to get that to happen. One of the things also is looking at that conveyance, the drainage swale or ditch between the wetland kettles in the park and the forested kettle. There's been some, evidence of active erosion. What can be done to stop that? First of all, slowing down the water coming from the kettles may help that in itself, but, should it be looking at riprap, turf reinforcement mat, native vegetation, root wads? There are a lot of things to look at, but that also requires design. You don't just, throw a bunch of root wads in and hope for the best. You have to look at the shear stresses and see what's really going to hold. So that might be something that's done in the future as well. And then also looking at aerial photos and doing the site investigation, you can see some of the smaller ditches from existing storm outfalls to the wetlands. So there's the one that comes along the west side of the park. You can see some erosion in there going into the western Kettle and Seminole Glen Park. So there are also some more opportunities for doing some channel restoration within the park and other areas within the watershed. Public education regarding backyard improvements. We all hear this all the time. Things we can do to not let the water run off our properties. Disconnect your downspouts. So if it drains to your driveway now, let it drain to the grass instead. Build a bioretention or a rain garden in your backyard. The hummingbirds and the bees love those. In addition, so you get entertained. And also rain barrels. Collect your roof runoff in a cistern. Use it to water your plants. So these are all things that not just the city of Fitchburg is focused on, but Dane County as a whole. And then finally, there is the potential for doing a wetland scrape, but it's probably unlikely. It's been something that's been talked about in the past. I think it may have been done at one point a long time ago.
Maybe 22 years ago.
That's
one of the lobes may have been dredged.
Right. There's evidence, maybe. So these are things that we're all looking at for the future. And so finally, what are the next steps? As I indicated, we're working on documentation right now. The report, it's 99% done, except for obviously that typo that we found. And then also the next step would be design and construction of the planned improvements. And at this point, they're looking at 23, 24 for the berm in the park in the capital improvement plan. And then Schumann Drive storm sewer would be part of a reconstruction project along Schumann Drive planned for 2025 at this point. And with that, I would like to thank you for coming out during your dinner hour. And if anybody has questions, I'm more than happy to answer.
Yeah.
Hi, I've got a couple questions and apologize in advance because I'm not an engineer, so I perhaps didn't understand parts
I
of what you were
apologize for being an
saying.
engineer, so.
Well, one of the things that the Parks Commission or the Parks Department did in the past was replace the paved paths within the park onto a raised berm because they were getting wet. And then there was concern about ice and freezing, et cetera. And some of the neighbors had observed that that is the point at which a ditch was created, a deepening, eroding ditch. So is there any scenario where also adding some culverts underneath that berm so the water goes over into the play fields in big rainfall events?
So we had talked about that. That was one of the things we first started looking at, is looking at what can we do to divert some of this water and not let it go into that kettle. You know, can we get it like over to the park? Can we store it there? Can we infiltrate it? Which are all great ideas. But unfortunately, you're just in a situation where the soils aren't really great for that. You can start doing underground infiltration, and that gets really expensive really, really fast. And the other complicating thing with underground infiltration is it tends to be out of sight, out of mind. And Fitchburg is really great about their maintenance and their maintenance agreements, but it is just easier for something to go wrong and have nobody really realize that there's a problem with the underground infiltration. And the third thing that makes it not work that well is that when you look at how much water it takes to fill that forested kettle at the bottom, that's a lot of water. And there's no way to infiltrate enough water to offset that risk of flooding. And it has to do with hydrology. You have to be able to store it somewhere long enough and get it deep enough to infiltrate. And you might make a dent, but it's not going to be nearly as effective as lowering the Schumann Drive storm sewer.
Okay, was the soils in that playfield area of the park actually tested that we know?
There were former, I don't know if that was particularly tested, but there were borings taken as part of, 4 or 5 years ago. I don't have the data on me, but there were soil. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, there were some soil borings taken in that general area. Basically, what those revealed were clay soils ranging from a few feet to several feet of pretty lean organic clay soils. Especially, there were hand augered borings taken in the wetlands themselves, and yeah, I mean it's just clay, so it's not the ideal soils for infiltration. And I guess to your point about kind of getting more water into the soccer fields and those other areas, and to what Anne Maria was saying, there's so much water in those big events that it doesn't have as big of an impact as one would maybe think. But that is kind of when we were talking about alternative 3, that includes the construction of that, like a 1 foot tall berm. That's kind of doing something similar to what you're getting at, is it's allowing water to stack up a little bit higher. But I think there's just kind of diminishing returns there.
And it has to do a little bit too with the timing, is that when you get a big storm, it's this huge, sharp peak, and an infiltration system goes over a very long time. And yeah, you'll do a little bit of shaving off that peak, but it's more of a, to me, that discussion almost belongs more in the what can we do in our backyards. That, I live in a neighborhood that was built in the 1960s, so the houses aren't, the yards are bigger, but the houses are also maybe a little bit bigger, and we have a lot of drainage issues where we've got water running down the street, and you look at, well, the only option is like to tear houses down, to build these huge detention basins, and is that really what we should be doing? But if everybody does their part, then you are actually making a bigger impact. Like if everybody puts a rain garden in their backyard, now you've cumulatively done much more than what would be effective in the park.
Okay. Another question I had was, I walked out a couple years ago, and of those two, I think the east wetland, to me, it was solidly packed with soil and vegetation. I walked right on it. Now it was dry. So is that not dredging? It would not do anything to help the scenario at all?
So it could. I mean, it's going to be a small amount, and that's something I think Ben can talk to a little bit more. The West Kettle, it sounds like, looks like it's naturally deeper, but you're right, that the East Kettle did have a lot more reed canary grass. Looks like there's some more sediment buildup in it, and you might be able to get a foot of storage out of it or so. But what happens then is, even if you dig it out, you're still going to often have water permanently pooled in there. And so water can't take the same place twice. Again, it could have a small impact, and it would depend upon city priorities, DNR permitting, and those are the big things.
And because those soils are so clayey, you'd end up, like Anne Marie said, getting water, probably just standing there for long periods of time. And these wetlands are considered ephemeral wetlands. So part of that means that they're actually dry for a portion of the year. And this was a discussion that was had with the DNR staff several years ago. And it's actually, for these types of wetlands, it's important to have these dry periods, mostly for amphibians. So if it was wet, you could start seeing fish, which will eat, eggs for turtles or frogs, salamanders. So that having kind of that standing water throughout the year could actually have some effects on just the whole ecosystem there. So it does get a little bit complicated just with all the different things kind of coming into play.
Okay, another question. Neighbors had talked about, or maybe others, the channel between the two, the east and west, was blocked or filled in, and is there some type of just regular maintenance that should be done, and does that create, and I'm getting at more, not the 100-year 2018 event or 1,000-year, but it's just some of the other day-to-day, year-to-year issues about improving how everything functions there.
So my recollection is that pipe is more of an equalizer pipe that lets water kind of flow back and forth depending upon which pond is a little bit higher at that given time. Mm-hmm. And my recollection is it was replaced several years ago with a newer pipe. I think it was increased in size from a 12 or an 18-inch, like corrugated metal pipe, which again, the smaller the pipe, the more likely it is to get clogged because cleaning out a 12-inch pipe, and I believe it's a 30 or 36-inch pipe now.
It's bigger than 12 now.
Yeah, it's bigger, and because of that, it might have had to be buried a little bit. And again, that sediment buildup, it's just kind of finding its equilibrium between where the sediment is in the two wetlands, and cleaning it out. might help, but eventually it's just going to settle back in. It's a buried culvert, I believe, more or less on purpose.
Okay, I think that may have been all my questions on my scribbled notes. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thanks for the questions.
Yes, you keep me on my toes because I'm not an ecologist.
Well, hey, I appreciate your work. Neither of you were here when like these problems kind of came up, and you're trying to fix it, which I really appreciate as a guy whose kids play in the kettle all the time and whose yard backs up to the kettle. So thank you for your work and your expertise. I think that generally a lot of like the neighbors are happy that this is happening, but also skeptical, right? Because again, you guys weren't here, but we were kind of told some things about, especially about the North Stoner Prairie development that like weren't true or weren't well researched, I should say. So I'm glad that you guys are trying to fix it. So I guess that the couple of observations that I have made are that I actually would love to see the culvert between the two ponds totally sedimented in, because that increases the capacity of the far west pond significantly. So when they, and actually, when I saw that they were replacing the culvert there, I actually like called City Hall immediately, like, hey, don't do this, because there was a ton of water in the west pond. And they said, no, it's going to be okay. You know, like, you really shouldn't do this because that water's going to flow right anyway. It created another huge erosion event, and because there was excess water in the west pond. So I actually think the more sediment that gets in that culvert, the better, in my opinion, because that's going to increase the capacity of that west pond.
And it is an equalizer pipe. And you're right, that if the water gets high enough in the west pond, it's still going to overtop that bike path.
Yeah, eventually.
Or the walking path and get into the east pond.
Yeah.
So, and if you get a really huge event, yes, it could, blow some of the sediment through and it'll flush out for a while. But over time, that will continue to sediment back in. And honestly, DNR often likes to see that again because it gives that natural bottom, especially for your critters like your amphibians or your herps and all that stuff. So
Yeah. So I think I actually like the idea of that thing sedimenting in, so I'm okay with that. I like the idea. I really am glad that you guys are considering that berm just to increase capacity. I think that that's really good, and trying to repair some of that erosion damage that's happened in that channel. I guess from my perspective, the higher the berm, the better. I think that you can create a natural, if the berm is high enough, of course, it would create a natural overflow into the park, right? Because I mean, when like we've kind of alluded to, the bike path being raised creates a natural, funnels that water into the kettle along where that erosion has happened. If that berm is high enough, you kind of reverse that, right? Because you're kind of using now the bike path as a berm in the other direction.
So there are a few things
Yeah, tell me all about
we need to be cognizant of is that anything that happens to those wetlands on Seminole Glen in that park area, whether there's a berm or how high it is, that is definitely going to require a wetlands and waterways permit from DNR.
Sure.
So that's not, we don't know. For us to say, yeah, we could build that berm 3 feet high or 4 feet high, that's still, out there somewhere. And also, we also need to be cognizant of not accidentally making it a regulated dam, which is also something that could happen. I'm pretty sure that Ben doesn't want to be the proud owner of a dam that's managed by DNR or requires management. So it's something that we don't know for sure that berm is going to be exactly 1 foot high. This is going to be something that kind of goes through probably a couple more iterations as it goes to design to find out what is the sweet spot where you get the absolute best or retention or the best results in downstream velocities and still get it through the DNR, all of those things, so.
Is there anything that like citizens can do to influence that process or to help with that process?
I will say this, that you are very fortunate in Fitchburg that your local DNR, both in your wetlands and waterways and your stormwater engineer are really great people. They're great to work with, and I think that they're very reasonable. And, people will tell horror stories about the DNR. It doesn't apply to these folks. So I think that, especially the stormwater engineer, I've known him for 25 years. It's great. In fact, I called him yesterday because I had some questions. And I know these are going to come up, and these predate me. And he's like, just a second. And he sends me the whole email chain, and there you go. So.
Yeah. So I think that, I can speak on behalf of the neighbors in the area that hey, we're around and we'd love to help and advocate in any way we can. Because I think, again, it sounds like you guys haven't settled on the height of the berm. I love the idea of the outlet pipe. I think that that's really great. And I think that, again, if the berm gets to the level of the bike path, you've kind of restored what the bike path interrupted, right? I mean, it was the bike path, which I think was probably very well intentioned, and I think it's great that people can bike on a dry bike path. That's great. But again, we're kind of, when we talk about putting a berm there, we're actually just restoring what was already there, right? So I don't know and I have no idea about DNR permitting and that sort of thing, but it seems to me like removing sediments that have occurred over time because of erosion, restoring the system to how it performed in the past. Again, I don't know how the DNR works, but it seems like that would be something they'd be into. But maybe I'm naive and.
No, I mean.
I know I'm naive, actually.
No, and again, like I said, we're not quite to design. We've got the model, and once we get to design, we'll have more information on topography, especially survey data. We've got information from, the aerial photography and the DEM, but in some respects, there's still no substitute for going out and getting the on-the-ground survey. And that's what's really going to inform design and final elevations as we go forward in conjunction with permitting through DNR.
Thank you. I think that the nice thing is that everything's dry right now. So hopefully it doesn't rain this summer, but I hope it rains a little bit. But I think that you can actually, even the West Pond is almost dry right now, which I've lived there for almost 10 years and I've never seen the West Pond dry. So it's definitely, I guess it's a good time to get the topography of the pond itself, because you can literally just walk out and.
Well, and if you ask about advocacy, again, I will, but my husband and I are both water resources engineers, and he does work for DNR, but not in this program. But we tell all of our neighbors, build the rain gardens in your backyard. It's just basically digging a bit of a hole and putting your plants in it. Put native plants in there. They've got long root systems that are 4 to 6 or more feet deep, so they make these macro pores so the water will go right down in. And it's we're all in this together. And this is kind of my soapbox, but doing the on-site stuff, disconnecting your rooftop gutters. If they're draining to the driveway, if you see a friend or a neighbor who has it draining to their driveway, say, hey, why don't you just put that so it drains across your front yard? And that makes a huge difference in terms of how fast the water gets and how much water gets into the streets and into the ponds.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. Huh.
Okay, my question goes back to the wooded kettle and the device you showed on screen that goes up, goes down, goes out. That's deepening the Schumann Drive.
Correct.
Storm drain.
Yep.
So that was described in context of the lowest home, the walkout of the home, but how does that protect, are we saying that that's our benchmark and not just getting more water out of the kettle to protect the roots of the oak trees?
So that's just it. So again, there are a couple constraints. One, the Schumann Drive storm sewer is going to have to be 7 feet deep, 7 feet deeper than it is now, which is really deep for a storm sewer system. And then again, if we lowered it even further, say to put it at the bottom of the kettle, you'd be getting yourself kind of crossways because of that magical 10-year water surface elevation where it's determined to be internally drained.
Okay. And I have another question.
Okay.
Is somebody going to weld shut that gate? Please? Because you see staff turnover and nobody remembers everything. And I would really just hate to see 15 years down the road, someone goes, well, we should open this up. And
I don't know. That's a question for Ben. Would it be taken out as part of the Schumann Drive?
Yeah, I'd assume, when we do that reconstruction project, we'd go in there and do something to the gate at that point.
And there was already a project in the capital improvement pipeline, pun intended, or not, to simply just make that part of the storm sewer larger.
It will have to be both deeper and larger.
So this is adding on, not just larger, but also deeper. Got
Yeah.
it.
Right, because right now, for the water to get from the kettle into the system, it has to overtop all the way into the road to get there. And by that point, the house is in trouble.
Yeah, understood.
And I think the existing storm sewer on Schumann in that location is an 18-inch pipe. It's pretty old, just, wasn't designed as big as we would have if it was done today.
Okay, well, I hope when you do go out and look, just the concern I hear, or just from my observation, if there's something, other simple things that can be done, not just for these gigantic storm events that were experienced that drive these studies, but to just make the other sort of big storms less of a problem, if there's a way of, if anything occurred when the path was raised and repaved that can be mitigated without ripping it all out, culverts, et cetera, I hope that that's part of the discussion.
Sure.